Arcades and arcade culture started with humble, coin-operated, and almost entirely mechanical machines. Pinball was at the forefront of coin machines, emerging near the mid-1930s. While their electronic complexity was lacking, they did manage to pick up quite a bit of popularity and eventually controversy. Some of the issues that surrounded arcades and even video games today were first directed towards pinball and other coin-operated machines. Although I wholeheartedly believe that pinball itself is one of the least offensive concepts possible, it presented itself as a gambling game when it first gained steam, causing pinball to become closely associated with drinking and smoking. Parents and citizens at the time were obviously worried about their youth. Their concerns culminated in 1942 in a now infamous legal attack on pinball. Fiorello LaGuardia, the New York City mayor, banned all forms of pinball in the city. This ban would last for 34 years until 1976. Several other cities would follow suit in the next couple of years. Whether you agree or not regarding games as being corruptive, it's very interesting to see the continuity in American society's reaction to the game entertainment industry. American society and American arcades are a lot different now than they were 80 years ago, and yet the same arguments for and against games still stand. As influential as pinball and other mechanical coin-operated machines were, they were quite limited in variation. Pinball and other games had different themes to them, such as cowboys and sports, but the objective was almost always the same. While this level of simplicity and low skill floor was great for expanding their reach, it also doomed the longevity of the market, with changes and improvements such as flippers and digital scoring coming only once per decade. All of this helped usher in the next major development: video game arcade machines. These video arcade machines were simply better than pinball in all ways possible. They were more creative, easier to maintain, and most importantly, made more money. When Atari's Pong cabinets first started making their ways into arcades in 1972, they generated about $40 of revenue every day, worth $220 today. The arcade industry exploded, giving way to consistent game releases, technological innovations, and even the home game console market. The golden age of arcades had begun. The late 1970s and early 1980s would herald household names such as Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, and Pac-Man. Pac-Man specifically was extremely popular at the time, appealing to casual and die-hard fans alike. Pac-Man became an international icon, with merchandising and branding rivaling that of more established characters, such as Hello Kitty. Video arcade games made it into everyday lives for American children in the 1980s. Arcades were on the same level of popularity as malls and roller skating rinks. Kids spent countless hours in arcades without adult supervision, which would eventually lead to the death of arcades. The death of arcade culture shows American societal effects and change better than anywhere else in arcade history. Just like pinball machines, video arcade cabinets were as controversial as they were popular. American society gave their children great amounts of autonomy in the 20th century. Kids were often left at home alone while their parents were at work, expected to play outside when they were young and hang out at stores when they were older. Arcades were quite a bit different from the usual. They were dark, crowded, musty, and anyone from anywhere could walk in and take advantage of children. More importantly, the content of the cabinets itself were thought to be bad influences, with games such as Narc sparking heavy debate. The birth of American arcade culture would dramatically shift the way parents see and care about their children. American society was no longer comfortable with giving their youth the same amount of freedom as before, and I strongly think that the effects of this can still be seen today in the way our parents raised us. As the 21st century started, Americans' children's independence ended. Arcade games also became too large of an industry for its own good. There were too many companies, too many games, and too many arcades. The constant flow of new products wasn't always better than the last, and more importantly, the harsh public attack of arcades meant death. Arcades had tried their best to advertise themselves as family-friendly centers, but to no avail. Even the 1982 Surgeon General made a statement regarding arcades, claiming arcades encaptured both body and soul in a negative way. The pinball stigma from decades ago was too strong, and arcades were accused of raising drug use, vandalism, and any other sort of corruption wherever they were. While the first wave of arcade classics, such as Asteroid, were quite abstract in their violence, as technology and graphics improved, games would become more and more vividly grotesque. The arcade industry finally crashed in 1983, with machines taking refuge in the same shady sites pinball had gone to years ago. In the span of about 7 years, arcades were revolutionized, made mainstream, and killed off. Similar to the credit bubble and eventual Great Depression 50 years ago, the arcade industry fell into a slump. Both the American society and economy no longer had interest in arcade games. People thought they were too dangerous and too addictive. Ironically, the home game console market, the same fledgling industry Pong had created in the 1970s, would seal the coffin on arcades with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. In a way, this makes perfect sense. American society was so worried about their children wasting money and possibly putting their health at risk when going to arcades. And home consoles accommodates both of these problems. American youth can now play the games that their parents bought for them under parental supervision. Once again, this shows the change in attitude of American parents. I don't think it would be a far cry if the death of arcades and emergence of home consoles had to do with the rising conservatism of the 1980s. American adults were heavily disillusioned by their government, and if health organizations were going to do anything drastic regarding arcades, then the parents would take it into their own hands. While there was a revival in more niche arcade games in 1991, specifically from the fighting game genre with the release of Street Fighter II, arcades had mostly become novelties by the 1990s. By now, the home console industry had proven it's here to stay, and arcades couldn't do much about it. Sega, Sony, and Nintendo absolutely dominated the video game market as a whole with their consoles. The hundreds of unique arcades in single cities alone dropped down to the tens and eventually scattered handfuls. Arcades only live on in small independent stores, meant to bring nostalgia rather than make any real amount of money, and chains such as Dave & Buster's, which arcade enthusiasts would be hard-pressed to classify as a real arcade. In closing, I want to say that it's hard for me to determine whether arcades were a net positive or negative on America. I believe that they're in a gray area, an industry too new and ahead of its own time, with its intentions misunderstood. Arcade games, even the more violent ones, never meant to destroy children and corrupt society. But people are genuinely worried that they would, and that's enough to justify their actions. It's interesting to see how concerned society was regarding new technology despite the internet not even being in the picture yet. The amount of worry regarding simple arcade games seems funny today compared to the much more violent themes and anonymous landscape of the internet. As mentioned before, the case against arcades and pinball very much transferred onto console video games and games as a whole. Just a couple of days ago, the World Health Organization, WHO, claimed that video game addiction is a real mental disorder. I'm not going to state whether I agree or not with this, but I will say that it's pretty fascinating that the same thing was being said about pinball almost a century ago. In this sense, I think arcades are still very much alive.